It was the height of summer, and Eric Holden was covering extra shifts at Yosemite National Park. He didn't mind. Out there, surrounded by granite cliffs and towering pines, everything else seemed small. Not a care in the world. That day, Eric was assigned to a distant part of the park, Hetch Hetchy. It was beautiful but remote, and not a lot of visitors ventured out there. His job was simple: check the trails for fallen debris, keep an eye out for wildlife, and make sure the few campers in the area were following the rules. See if anyone needed help or had questions. Easy enough. It was a few hours into his patrol when he got a call on his radio. A couple staying at one of the backcountry sites reported hearing strange noises near their campsite the previous night. They said they couldn't pinpoint what it was and wanted a ranger to check it out just in case. Eric volunteered. It wasn't unusual for animals to get curious around campsites, and besides, he didn't mind an excuse to hike out there. The trail was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get miles away from civilization. Every now and then he'd stop to listen. Nothing. Not even the chirp of a bird. That struck him as odd. Usually the forest was alive with sound at this time of day. But at first he found it peaceful. He reached the couple's campsite easy enough, but they seemed overly relieved to see him and wasted no time explaining what had happened. Around 3 a.m., they'd heard what they described as heavy breathing just outside their tent. Then came the sound of something moving, slow, deliberate steps that circled the tent for several minutes before fading into the distance. When they finally worked up the courage to peek outside, there was nothing there. Eric nodded along, keeping his expression neutral. People spooked easily in the woods, especially at night. Still, he didn't dismiss them outright. He assured them he'd stick around for a bit and take a look. The couple stayed close to their tent while Eric walked the perimeter of the campsite. His flashlight beam swept over the ground, revealing nothing unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of an animal. He was just about to head back when he noticed something odd. A patch of flattened grass a few yards away. It looked like something or someone had been lying there recently. Kneeling down, he inspected the area. The grass was pressed down in a long, narrow shape, almost like a body, but it was the size that gave him pause. It was much too large for a person. His stomach tightened. Maybe it was a bear. That would explain the couple's story. He was about to stand when he caught a faint whiff of something foul. It wasn't the usual musky smell of a bear or the earthy scent of the forest. It was sharp, almost metallic, and it made his nose wrinkle. He shone his flashlight around looking for clues as to what had been there, but nothing stood out. He returned to the campsite and told the couple to keep their food stored properly and avoid hiking at night. They seemed satisfied with his explanation, and Eric began the trek back to his truck. The forest was darker now, the last light of day swallowed by the thick canopy above. He moved quickly, eager to get back. About halfway down the trail, he heard it and instantly knew the situation was coming full circle. A low rhythmic sound like breathing, but not quite. It was too steady, too measured, almost mechanical. Eric stopped dead in his tracks, his hand instinctively going to the can of bear spray on his belt. He turned slowly, sweeping his flashlight behind him. The beam caught a pair of eyes. They were high up, maybe 7 or 8 feet off the ground, and reflected the light back at him in a way that made his skin crawl. "Hey," he called out, his voice trembling despite himself. "Get out of here." The eyes blinked, and for a second, he thought whatever it was might retreat. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from behind the trees. What emerged wasn't any animal Eric had ever seen. It was tall, with a gaunt frame covered in what looked like patchy fur. Its limbs were long and sinewy, almost insect-like in their movements. The head was the worst part, elongated with deep-set eyes and a mouth that hung open slightly, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too irregular. Eric's throat went dry. He raised his flashlight higher, hoping the bright light might scare it off. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying him and took another step closer. "Back off," he yelled, fumbling for his bear spray. His hand shook as he aimed and sprayed a cloud of the repellent toward the creature. It reacted immediately, letting out a screech that made Eric's ears ring. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard, like metal grinding against metal mixed with a high-pitched wail. The creature staggered back, clawing at its face, and Eric didn't wait to understand or see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted down the trail. He didn't stop until he saw the faint outline of his truck in the distance. Throwing himself into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and started the engine. His hands were still shaking as he backed out of the narrow dirt lot, the headlights illuminating the trail ahead. He half expected to see the creature charging after him, but the road was empty. Eric didn't report the encounter. What would he even say? That he'd seen some kind of monster in the woods. He knew how it would sound. People would think he was overtired, or worse, losing it. Over the next few weeks, he avoided Hetch Hetchy entirely. When other rangers asked why, he shrugged it off, saying he needed a change of scenery. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even in other parts of the park. Every so often, he'd hear that same rhythmic breathing in the back of his mind, like it was burned into his memory. And on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, he swore he could catch a faint whiff of that metallic smell again. It was late October when Jake Sanders, a 10-year park ranger at Glacier National Park, found himself on the graveyard shift. Glacier was breathtaking, sure, but nights up there could feel endless. The wind howled through the mountains, and with most visitors gone for the season, the park was eerily silent. The occasional coyote yip or owl hoot only added to the isolation. His shift started like any other, a routine patrol through the main roads and campgrounds to ensure everything was in order. He was driving his truck along a gravel path that bordered Lake McDonald, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. That's when his radio crackled to life. It was Sarah, the ranger working the northern sector. "Jake, you around?" Her voice had an edge to it. "Yeah, what's up?" he replied, pulling over to grab the radio off the dash. "Got a weird report from a camper near Bowman Lake. Says they heard something big moving around outside their tent. Thought it might be a grizzly, but I don't know. The way they described it didn't sound right." Jake sighed. "Could be a bear. They're still active this time of year." "Could be," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Mind swinging by? I'm tied up here." Bowman Lake was a good 40 minutes from where Jake was, but with the park so empty, it wasn't like he had much else to do. "On my way." The drive was uneventful until he turned onto the narrow road leading to Bowman Lake. That's when his headlights caught something odd. A tree branch, thick and gnarled, was lying across the road. Jake stopped the truck, groaning. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, the cold air biting at his face. The branch was heavy, but manageable. As he dragged it off the road, he noticed something that made him pause. Deep gouges in the bark, like something with claws had torn into it. "Bear," he muttered to himself, though the marks looked bigger than what he'd usually see. He didn't dwell on it. Bears could be unpredictable, especially as they prepared for hibernation. He got back in the truck and continued on, arriving at the Bowman Lake campground just before midnight. The place was deserted except for one lone tent near the tree line. Jake parked a little ways off and walked toward it, calling out softly so as not to startle anyone. A man poked his head out of the tent, his face pale. "Ranger? Thank God," the man said, stepping out and pulling a jacket around himself. "I thought I was losing my mind." Jake asked the usual questions. What had he heard, when, and where? The camper, a guy named Mark, described it as heavy footsteps circling his tent, accompanied by a low, guttural sound. He'd shown his flashlight out at one point, but didn't see anything. "It wasn't a bear," Mark insisted. "I've camped enough to know what a bear sounds like." Jake nodded, though inwardly he chalked it up to nerves. People often got spooked in the woods, especially at night. "I'll take a look around," he said. "You stay put." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. Jake headed toward the tree line, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. He scanned the ground for tracks, and soon found something. An impression in the dirt, large and oddly shaped. It wasn't quite a paw print, but it wasn't human either. It looked almost like a hand, but broader, with deep grooves where claws might have been. He squatted down, his breath visible in the cold air. "What the hell?" he murmured. The print was fresh. A sound behind him made him whip around, heart pounding. It was faint, almost like a branch snapping, but it was enough to put him on edge. He stood and shone his flashlight toward the noise. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a figure standing between the trees, partially obscured. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a hunched posture that made it look even more menacing. Its eyes, or what he thought were eyes, reflected the light back at him like a predator's would. Jake froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The thing let out a sound, low and guttural, just as Mark had described. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was something in between, almost like it was testing him. Jake took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray on his belt. The creature didn't move, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the trees. Jake stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He wanted to follow it, to confirm what he'd seen, but another part of him screamed that he'd be an idiot to do so. He made his way back to the campground, moving quickly but trying not to look like he was panicking. Mark was waiting for him, his face a mix of relief and fear. "Did you see it?" he asked. Jake didn't answer right away. What could he say? "I didn't see a bear," he finally said, "but you should pack up and head out first thing in the morning." Mark didn't argue. Jake stayed until dawn, sitting in his truck with the engine off, watching the tree line. He didn't see the creature again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there watching him. When his shift ended, he reported the incident to his supervisor, leaving out the details of what he'd actually seen. He said it was probably a bear, but suggested closing off the campground for a few days, just to be safe. His supervisor agreed, though Jake could tell he didn't think much of it. Jake never told anyone else what happened that night. Not Sarah, not his family, not the rangers who replaced him at Bowman Lake. It wasn't that he didn't believe what he'd seen. He did, but saying it out loud made it too real, and Jake wasn't sure he wanted to deal with the implications. He still works at Glacier, but he avoids Bowman Lake whenever he can. Every now and then, when he's alone in the park at night, he thinks he hears that sound again, low, guttural, and impossible to forget. Evelyn Brooks wasn't new to the oddities of her job as a ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Over the years, she'd dealt with lost hikers, overzealous campers, and even the occasional black bear encounter. But the park was more than its wildlife and trails. It had a history, old and layered, with whispers of things people couldn't quite explain. Evelyn wasn't much for superstition, though. She believed in facts, in what she could see and touch. That belief was put to the test one late autumn evening. Her shift had stretched longer than usual after a call came in about a missing teenager. The boy had wandered off from his family during a hike near Cades Cove. The area was popular, but it was also expansive, with trails that wound through dense woods and opened into misty meadows. It was easy to get turned around, especially as night crept in. By the time Evelyn set out, dusk had fallen. She carried her flashlight, a radio, and a map of the area, double-checking the family's description of the boy. 13 years old, wearing a red hoodie and jeans. Simple enough to spot, she thought. Her radio crackled as another ranger updated her. "We've got a few volunteers combing the eastern trails. Nothing yet." Evelyn responded, "I'll take the ridge loop by myself, then cut through the valley. He's probably just hunkered down somewhere." But as she started up the ridge trail, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The woods felt heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every step you take. Even the usual forest sounds, crickets, the rustle of leaves, were muted. It wasn't like her to get spooked, but she chalked it up to the pressure of the search. About half an hour in, she found the first clue. A small candy wrapper, half buried in the dirt. It was crumpled, like it had been stepped on. Evelyn crouched down, her flashlight illuminating the shiny foil. "All right," she muttered to herself. "At least I know I'm in the right area." She radioed in the find, then continued along the trail. The path narrowed as it climbed, flanked by thick clusters of rhododendron that cast long shadows. Evelyn caught herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, even though she knew she was alone. At least, she thought she was. That's when she heard it. A voice, faint, almost like it was carried on the wind. "Help!" She stopped, her heart quickening. "Ryan?" she called, remembering the boy's name. "Is that you?" There was no response, just the faint rustle of leaves. Evelyn strained to listen, and after a moment, she heard it again. "Help!" It was definitely a boy's voice, but something about it sounded off. It was too distant, too steady, like it wasn't coming from one spot but from everywhere at once. Evelyn's grip tightened on her flashlight. "Ryan, keep calling out. I'm coming to you." She left the trail, pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. The ground was uneven, and the branches snagged at her jacket, but the voice kept her moving. It sounded closer now, just over the next rise. When she crested the hill, she stopped cold. In the clearing below, her flashlight caught the figure of a boy in a red hoodie. He was standing perfectly still, his back to her. "Ryan," she called out, relief flooding her. "It's Ranger Brooks. I'm here to help." He didn't move. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Ryan?" she called again, more cautiously this time. She started down the slope, her boots crunching on the dry leaves. When she was about 20 feet away, the boy turned around. Her flashlight beam caught his face, and she froze. It wasn't that he looked wrong. He had the freckles and dark hair the family had described, but his expression was blank, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't really seeing her. "Ryan, are you hurt?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "No." He tilted his head slightly like he was trying to understand her. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from a lost kid finding help. It was too wide, too deliberate, like he was mimicking something he'd seen. Evelyn's unease deepened. "All right," she said carefully. "Let's get you back to your family. Follow me." The boy didn't move. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed behind her. Evelyn whipped around, her flashlight cutting through the trees. There was nothing there, just darkness. She turned back, but the boy was gone. The clearing was empty. Her heart was racing now. "Ryan!" she shouted, spinning in place. "Where are you?" The forest seemed to close in around her, the silence pressing against her ears. That's when she noticed something else. Her flashlight beam, which had been steady moments ago, was flickering. The light dimmed, then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Evelyn fumbled for her backup light, cursing under her breath. As she clicked it on, she heard the voice again. "Help!" It was behind her this time, closer than before. She turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The voice came again, but now it wasn't just one. There were multiple voices overlapping, all saying the same thing. "Help! Help! Help!" Evelyn backed up, her breath coming in quick gasps. The voices grew louder, echoing through the trees. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement, shadows shifting unnaturally, darting between the trees. They weren't people and they weren't animals. They were something else, shapes that didn't make sense, bending and twisting in ways that hurt her eyes to look at, and they were coming at her. Her instincts took over. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where she was going as long as it was away. The voices followed, growing more frantic, more desperate. "Help! Help! Help!" Evelyn didn't stop until she broke through the tree line and stumbled back onto the trail. She bent over, hands on her knees, gasping for air. The voices were gone. The woods were silent again. She didn't wait around to see if they'd return. She radioed the other rangers, her voice shaking, and reported that she'd lost the trail. The boy was still missing. When they found him the next morning, he was sitting at a different campsite, unharmed but confused. He didn't remember wandering off and didn't seem to recognize Evelyn when she asked if he'd seen her the night before. Evelyn didn't press him. She wrote up her report, leaving out the parts that would raise questions she didn't want to answer. She still works at the park, but she avoids Cades Cove whenever she can. There are things in those woods, things that don't belong, and she's learned the hard way that not every voice calling for help is one you should follow.